All right, day 2 of Cycles in the Biosphere. We're on page 284, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle. Nearly 80% of Earth's atmosphere consists of nitrogen gas. Squiggle 80%, atmosphere equals capital N2 gas. Plants and animals need nitrogen to make proteins and other important compounds. Makes proteins, zoop, other compounds. However, most living things cannot use nitrogen gas. Can't use N2 gas. The nitrogen must somehow be converted into the nitrogen compounds that living things can use. Need compounds. The process of changing nitrogen gas into usable nitrogen compounds is called nitrogen fixation. Lightning is responsible for some nitrogen fixation. The energy released by lightning acts to combine nitrogen and oxygen in the air. The compounds formed dissolve in rainwater. Most nitrogen fixation results from the action of special bacteria. Most fixation by bacteria. Some of the bacteria live in soil or water. In soil/water. Other nitrogen-fixing bacteria live on the roots of certain plants, such as clover, peanuts, soybeans, and peas. Example given, E.G. on roots of plants. The bacteria form bumps called nodules. Say that, nodules, on the roots of these plants. Nodules. The bacteria get food and protection from the plant roots. Bacteria get food and protection. In return, they perform nitrogen fixation. Give, capital N, fixation, meaning it's fixed to or attached to the bacteria and the plant roots so they can use it. If plants and animals continued to take in nitrogen compounds, eventually all the nitrogen in the environment would be stored in the bodies of living things. Of course, this does not happen. Certain kinds of bacteria and fungi decompose or break down animal waste products, as well as dead plants and animals. As a result of the decomposition, nitrogen compounds return to the soil. Decomposers, capital N, arrow, soil. Decomposers return nitrogen to the soil. Plants can then reuse the compounds. Other bacteria change nitrogen compounds in the soil into the nitrogen gas found in the air. Some bacteria, arrow, into gas. Human activities can alter the nitrogen cycle, sometimes adding or taking away the usable nitrogen in the soil. Humans remove capital N for nitrogen. When crops are harvested, the nitrogen in plants is removed with the plants. Harvest crops. Erosion and irrigation can also wash nitrogen compounds out of the soil. Erosion/irrigation. To replace nitrogen, farmers add nitrogen-rich fertilizers. Add fertilizer. They also raise peanuts or other plants that support nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Okay, the energy that lightning bolt releases can fix nitrogen in the air, changing nitrogen gas into nitrogen compounds. That's pretty cool, but it doesn't happen very much, and it's on a much smaller scale than the bacteria. So we didn't really take notes on that. Nitrogen can be fixed artificially, then packaged as fertilizer. Today, most crops depend on fertilized soil. So when you see the little grains of fertilizer, or if there's a fertilizer liquid that has to be put in the water or sprayed on the ground, that's fixing the nitrogen to a little compound or a little grain of like dust or a little grain of fertilizer compound, or it's fixing it into the water to put in. Otherwise, it would just be nitrogen gas, and as we've already seen, plants can't use nitrogen gas. Most things cannot. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria form a close relationship with many plants, including peanuts. So on the surface of the nuts that are under the ground, you get these little bacteria that fix the nitrogen, or they grab the nitrogen and hold on to it so that the plant can use it as a fertilizer. Okay, here is a picture of the nitrogen cycle. So that's on page 285, right here, page 285. Anytime we put a page number, we know that means that there's a good picture. Okay, nitrogen in the air. Remember, there's 80% of the atmosphere is nitrogen in the air, so there's a lot of nitrogen in the air. Plants like clover use nitrogen compounds in the soil, so that helps them grow. There are bacteria down in the soil that can grab the nitrogen and hold on to it or fix it so that the plants can use it as a fertilizer. Decomposers can return nitrogen into the soil, again, for it to be fixed by bacteria so that the plants can use it for a fertilizer. There are nitrogen compounds in the soil. Some bacteria can change that back into a nitrogen gas that leaches out of the ground and mixes in with the air. Cows get nitrogen by eating clover. So when you eat the plants that have nitrogen, you get nitrogen from that as an animal or a plant or a human. I'm sorry, not a plant. An animal, a human, an organism, any living organism that eats plants or eats the animals that are eating the plants. So predators and prey. Okay, what else? What must happen before nitrogen can be used by most organisms? Okay. Before nitrogen can be used by most organisms, Zoop, nitrogen gas must be fixed by bacteria into compounds that are usable. So the bacteria have to grab or fix the nitrogen so that the plants can use it as a fertilizer or so that that plant can be eaten by an animal and be used. Most organisms can't use nitrogen gas. Okay, turn the page. 286, the water cycle. Okay, there's a good picture. So next to water cycle, page 286. On the left half of your paper, make sure that you have some separation. Draw that picture. Draw the water, little waves. Draw an arrow going up to the word evaporation. Draw the sun with maybe some little rays of sunshine coming down. An arrow going up to condensation. An arrow coming over towards a cloud. A bunch of little dots for precipitation. And an arrow going back to the water. That's the water cycle, basically. All right, the water cycle is the continuous movement of water between Earth's surface and the atmosphere. Continuous movement of water, surface, atmosphere. One arrow going over towards atmosphere and another one coming back to surface. Powered by the sun, the water cycle is essential to all land ecosystems. Powered by sun, capital S, it's the name of it. In the water cycle, water moves between the living and non-living parts of the environment. The sun heats and evaporates water from Earth's surface and oceans. Okay, there it is there. So, sun heats water, evaporation. Plants also release water into the atmosphere through holes in their leaves. The process through which water evaporates from plant leaves is known as transpiration. Before we get to that, let's go ahead and do the other parts. Okay? What is condensation? It's clouds forming. So, clouds form, condensation. Rain/snow falls, precipitation. So those are those three main parts of the water cycle. Now we can say that plants, quote unquote, sweat, and that's transpiration. In other words, evaporation from plants. Right? Imagine a cactus out in the middle of the desert where it's super hot. Well, they have to stay cool so they can kind of sweat similar to how we do. They release some of that moisture to stay cool, or the heat bakes it off of them. So you get evaporation from plants. This is a big deal, especially in giant rainforests like in Brazil and Africa. There is so much moisture, it changes weather patterns and climate. All right, water vapor cools and condenses as it rises through the atmosphere. Clouds form. Okay, clouds form, condensation. Eventually, water falls to the ground as precipitation. Rain, snow falls, precipitation. Most precipitation falls on Earth's oceans. The precipitation that falls on land is absorbed into the ground, is taken up by plants, or flows to a body of water as runoff. The cycle can then begin anew. Okay, we already learned about all that stuff way back at the beginning of the year. Animals, including humans, also take part in the water cycle. They release water in their urine, perspiration, and exhaled air. Organisms use water to live, release sweat, that's the perspiration, breath, that's the exhaled air, urine, that's going to the bathroom. Okay, how are living organisms involved in the water cycle? Living organisms are involved in the water cycle because they use water to live and also release it back to the environment in the form of sweat, breath, and urine. Look at the picture of the water cycle. Evaporation. The sun causes liquid water to rise as water vapor, so it evaporates, becomes moisture in the air. Condensation. Water vapor cools to form tiny droplets. It cools, forms tiny droplets, and condenses into clouds. Precipitation. Its forms include rain, snow, sleet, and hail. So if it gets cool enough and heavy enough, it will fall out of the sky, become runoff, leach into the ground, become groundwater, get used by plants, go to a lake or the ocean, all sorts of different things. Water cycles over and over again among Earth's air, ground, oceans, and living things. Okay, time to get out your highlighter and your annotating red pen. Highlighter and red pen. Visual summary. Photosynthesis and respiration are opposite processes. So let's look at our main idea. Okay, photosynthesis, highlight it. Respiration, highlight it. Photosynthesis, respiration, photosynthesis, respiration. Opposite processes. Flipping over, photosynthesis, respiration. Okay. Plants produce oxygen that animals need, and animals produce carbon dioxide that plants need. Okay, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Let's see, there's carbon dioxide in these little equations. The plants are producing oxygen. Highlight the oxygens, highlight the carbon dioxides. Algae and plants are creating that oxygen. They rely on each other. They use each other's products, right? Plants are doing photosynthesis. They're turning carbon dioxide into oxygen. Organisms and animals and humans are doing respiration. We're using that oxygen and putting back CO2. And that's what the plants need to do photosynthesis. So the two sets of organisms rely on each other. We're using each other's products. Okay, flip it over. Let's see. Carbon dioxide gets used by plants and they create sugar. That's how they store their energy. When they break that sugar or use it, they get energy out of it and it turns back into CO2. That's the respiration that the animals do, right? The plants need that carbon dioxide again, so that's why we highlight it. Okay, let's see what's up next. Carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen cycle through the environment as they are used and produced by organisms. Okay, highlight nitrogen in the main idea. Go to the nitrogen cycle, highlight it. Most fixation by bacteria. Bacteria are doing most of that work. They're doing most of the work here. Bacteria get food and protection, but they give nitrogen fixation, right? So why is it mostly bacteria? Well, they're getting food or they're getting a place to live on the roots of the plants, but in return they're grabbing onto that nitrogen and holding it so the plants can use it. In the water cycle, water moves between the living and non-living parts of the environment. Okay, water cycle. Organisms are using those things, all these things. Highlight those. Flipping it back over. All done with all those highlights. Water cycle. Well, what are the three parts? Highlight the three parts. Highlight the three parts. It's continuous, right? It's moving between them, between the living and the non-living. That's continuous. How does it do that? It's powered by the sun. That's very important. How are living things involved? The living parts. How are they involved? Well, plants kind of sweat or transpirate. or transpire. They have transpiration happening. It's like evaporation happening, but it's from plants. And organisms use water to live, but they also release it back. So they're part of the cycle. Okay, now the red annotating. Obviously, these four things, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water. Those are the four important cycles that this whole lesson's about, so you need to put red stars next to those four things. And then the other important thing is organisms are using all four of these, so organisms use them. Okay, photosynthesis, that's how the plants are part of oxygen and carbon cycles. Let's see. Respiration, those are the two kind of opposites. Remember we talked about opposite processes, so highlight those two. Annotate those two. Plants are doing this work to create oxygen. Annotate it. It's called photosynthesis, where they turn carbon dioxide into oxygen we can use. Annotate it. Respiration, we use that oxygen and give back carbon dioxide. Annotate it. We're using each other's products. It's an opposite process. We're relying on each other. Annotate it. Up here for carbon and oxygen cycles. Carbon is a basic part of living things, right? Why do we need carbon? That's the structure of our cells, or that's the structure of the plant cells. Annotate it. CO2. Plants using CO2 to make sugars, and then that being used to get energy, and it goes back to CO2. That's an important cycle. That's the carbon cycle happening with carbon dioxide. That's part of photosynthesis and respiration. So, annotate it. Nitrogen cycle, an important cycle. Annotate it. Why is nitrogen important? It helps us make proteins and other compounds. Annotate it. How does it happen? Bacteria fix the nitrogen. They grab it or hold on to it. It's basically like fertilizer. And the water cycle. Okay, we know those three parts from before, but it's important that it's powered by the sun. All that energy coming in from the sun. That's actually helping all these cycles. It's helping photosynthesis, which is helping respiration, which is also helping the water cycle, which is also helping the nitrogen cycle because the plants rely on that. Notice how all four of these cycles tend to involve plants and the sun. That's very important. All four cycles in this lesson involve plants and the sun. All right, now the plants can kind of sweat or transpiration, right? Some of that water goes back into the atmosphere from plants because they're evaporating it, but it's called transpiration. Organisms use water to live. That's an important point. Annotate it. Okay, now you would go do phase 3, connecting. You're connecting a thought and things you know in your brain to what's on paper. Again, let me repeat this because we're still having trouble with it. What you know is in your brain, not on this piece of paper. If you write, I know, blah, 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 and it's from this piece of paper, no, that's not right. Now, maybe I know that photosynthesis does something else, like maybe I know that only plants can do photosynthesis, and that helps provide food for animals that eat the plants. Okay, now I'm adding something to it. I added the whole point about plants doing it, only plants doing it, and I added the part about animals eating it, which is going to lead into the future of food cycles, food webs, food chains, predators and prey, and all that kind of stuff. But if you just tell me, I know that photosynthesis turns carbon dioxide into oxygen, no, that's in our notes. That's not from your brain. That's not connecting your thinking. I predict or I wonder, right? What can you predict from all of this? Why are they telling us about all these cycles and how the plants and animals are involved and why the sun's so important? Why do they keep kind of hinting at things like food and compounds and basic parts of living things? What are we going to be talking about next? Okay, then copy the main idea straight out of the notes or straight out of the book. And then you write your summary paragraph, right? So it's going to sound something like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water cycle through the biosphere. Organisms use them again and again. In the oxygen cycle, plants perform photosynthesis, turning carbon dioxide into oxygen. And then organisms, animals, and humans perform respiration to use that oxygen, giving carbon dioxide back to the plants so they can do their photosynthesis. Okay, that covered those two. The nitrogen cycle is important because bacteria fix or grab the nitrogen so that plants can use it, kind of like a fertilizer. See, we just talked about the nitrogen, now the water cycle. The water cycle involves water moving throughout the biosphere. Organisms such as plants can transpirate or, no, let's say that again. Okay. Plants sometimes evaporate water, which is called transpiration, and that water continues to cycle through the water cycle so that organisms can use the water to live. Okay, something like that. All right, see how you have to think about it, and then you kind of have to type it or write it down in your e-binder. You literally go grab some of these notes, like algae and plants, arrow, oxygen, put it in your e-binder. Then take your time, revise and edit, and turn it into a complete sentence with capitals at the beginning, periods at the end, the, and, of, all those other words that fit in between. It needs to sound like a complete sentence. All right, good luck, persevere, have a growth mindset, go roar, Wildcats.